Good morning. Thank you all for coming, especially for taking time out from all the really, really cool hacker stuff that's going on in the other rooms to come in here and talk a little bit of risk analysis and metrics. My name is Walt Williams. I'm a manager of security and compliance at a small startup in the Northeast called Lattice Engines. I've pretty much done everything in information security, from public infrastructures, meta directories, LDAP, vulnerability assessments, et cetera, et cetera. You can read the laundry list. The key thing is that there are seats over here. I've been doing risk analysis for about 6-7 years now, using various methodologies, and I was very excited a few years ago to learn of some systematic attempts to put some metrics behind risk analytics, and I've discovered that nobody has ever shared the formulas. They've shared the ideas, they've shared the methodologies, but the actual formulas to produce the analysis, oh, that's proprietary. That's nice. And then Dr. Lloyd stood up in front of a crowd of Bsides attendees back this past February or March at the RSA Bsides conference and gave a great talk on risk analytics, with the idea that, we could derive some metrics by just using some numbers that we have in front of us. I want to take that one step further. But before I do, I want to extend good thanks to Dr. Mike Lloyd for introducing the idea that you can talk about risk and metrics at the Bsides event, and some of my mentors and some of the other folks who have inspired me to work in this field. So let's start out with putting ourselves on the same plate. What the hell do I mean when I talk about information security risk? What is risk? Information security risk is a subset of business risk. It is not the cogs that drive the machine. It is something that works within the machine that is already working. It should help business people make business decisions, not help security people say to the business, no, you can't do that. There are many different definitions for risk. This is the classic one. Risk is the probability of an event times the impact of the same event. I'm sorry to say, but this is garbage. This allows you to classify spam, a high probability but negligible impact event, having exactly the same risk as a bomb going off in the lobby of your building. An extremely low probability but high impact event. When it comes to formulas used to analyze, is this more important than that? Do we expend the same amount of money to protect against this than that? This is garbage. This does not help you make an intelligent decision. And yes, this is the metric our government uses to do risk analytics. This is from NIST. So what is risk and how can we measure it? I took a look at the ISO 27005 definition. A lot of people talk about ISO compliance 27001, 27002. ISO's got a great standard in 27005 that has been extended, and it is designed to be flexible and extensible. But the idea is that a risk is the potential that a given threat will have an impact on an asset or group of assets or an entire company, causing harm to the organization. I like that word, harm. It's the same thing as impact. That's a metric. That's something that we can tangibly measure. The trick is to get to an understanding of what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the assets, and finally, what are the different harms. There are different methodologies that you can use to get to this point. Obviously, I'm going to be working with ISO 27005 here, but Octave is great if you happen to like it. It takes a lot of effort to drive into a non-military organization. Risk IT is great if you're using COPIT. If you're not using COPIT, it won't slide into your organization so well. If you're stuck in the government and you can't use Octave, you're probably forced to use NIST. And that's got that classic definition of risk that's just got to go. And finally, there's TARA. And TARA does the same sort of thing for Intel that Dr. Lloyd did for the rest of us, and that takes a look at attack risk metrics. Now, as you go through a risk analysis process, that fits inside of a risk management process. Remember, the goal here is not to stop at analysis. The goal here is to manage your risks. And all of these charts that you see here were stolen liberally from a lovely paper that I will cite in just a few minutes. But the idea is, how is risk identified? How is risk estimated? How is risk evaluated? Let's start with identification. What are the assets in your scope? Are you looking at the entire company? Are you looking at a subset of the company? Are you looking at the project in front of you? That defines what you mean by scope. What are the threats impacting that scope? What are the controls within scope? What are the vulnerabilities? Probably most important from at least my perspective, are what are the consequences if you get this wrong? Or what are the consequences if somebody gets through your protections? The Open Group took ISO 27005 and inserted that methodology I made reference to without naming it earlier, and that's the factor analysis of information risk. FAIR is a great methodology of doing data analytics, but they don't publish the formulas. They keep those proprietary. If you go to the organization behind it and you say, okay, this is wonderful stuff, I want to use your tools, they're going to hand you a check or an invoice for $30,000. Say, we'd love to how you use our tools. I have no idea what their tool does. I'm not attempting to reverse engineer their tool, but I took their ideas specifically as refined through the Open Group's integration of their tool into ISO 27005, and I said, you know, this is FAIR done better. And I invented my own tool, and that's part of what I'm going to present to you later today. So, first of all, what's an asset? Some people can say my asset is my phone book. That's a very low-cost asset, but for a sales manager, that just might be his most important asset. Other people are going to say my asset's my internet connection. Other people are going to say my asset's this mainframe. Another person is going to say, no, my asset are my customers. And guess what? They're all right. There is no one definition for an asset within an organization. We should not be telling them, no, I only want to look at this kind of asset. No, you need to be looking at every single asset in your organization. Listen to what they have to tell you. Get an idea, an estimation of how valuable those assets are to the individual you're talking to, and aggregate that data. If they don't know how valuable they are, talk to them about what would happen if this was not available to you for a 24-hour period of time. If you put the question in those terms, you'll be surprised exactly how quickly you get value out of an asset definition. And oh, by the way, staplers may be an asset, but you don't put them in a bank vault just because they happen to be a business asset. Different assets do have different levels of value, and therefore different needs for security. Now, value is much more than just money. Value could be the criticality of something, the sensitivity, the loss of productivity if it disappeared. It could be the cost of responding to an incident of something that hit that asset. The value could be around fines incurred. It could be the impact to your reputation. The asset value could be the impact to the investors, something that you might not know about for 2 or 3 years down the line. All of these things can be estimated if you can't computate the exact value. But try to, but just use leading questions such as, what would happen to you? What would happen to your organization? What would happen to the larger organization if this was not available for a defined period of time? Then extrapolate out from that. That gets you to impact, that gets you to harm. You've already got the beginnings of a metric. The trick is that these are always going to be just estimates, and you can get to better estimates. Threats. Different kind of threats have different kind of impacts, but the lovely thing is that the things that you do sometimes to protect against one kind of threat are things that you do to protect against other kinds of threats. So a bomb, an earthquake, a tornado, tsunami, you can protect against them the same different way. What you're protecting against is the impact. You're not protecting against the actual threat itself. So if you protect against the point of egress for a threat, you're done. If there's no way for the threat to act on an asset, you're protected. A great category of threats that's out there ready to be used are the basal threat categories. Nice thing is that the basal threat categories provided us with a tool that we can use for risk measurement. It's old, it's venerable, It's a risk spreadsheet, and the risk spreadsheet that I'm using is based upon this work. And by the way, I'm fully willing to distribute the tool that I've used. Just give me your contact data, and I'll be happy to get it here. But it's got some pretty reasonable categories: internal, external fraud, employee practices, fines, damage to physical assets, business disruption, execution, delivery process management. Excellent categories with a heck of a lot of details behind all of that. This is an eye chart. I don't expect you to read it. It's all within the spreadsheet, and it's all very well laid out. And obviously, some things are going to be more applicable to you than others, but you can add to this if there's something that you need that's a threat to your organization that's just not covered. These things are extensible. Controls. We all have them, I hope, and they can all be better, assuredly. You should know what your controls are. You should know why you have the controls you have. You should know how effective they are. We all know how to get to that point. That's why we're here. That's why we sit down and talk with each other. But in case you didn't know, how do you get this knowledge? You ask, you audit, you test. Simple, basic stuff. The control catalogs that I've used in the spreadsheet are based upon ISO 27002. It's not perfect. It is a starting point. You can use BITS if you prefer. You can use COVID if you prefer. You can use PCI if you prefer. They all cover the same basic elements. Vulnerability. This is a method through which a threat can act on an asset. Some people confuse vulnerability with risk. It's possible to have business risk without having any vulnerabilities. That's why we have disaster recovery facilities. That's why we have business continuity facilities, because you simply don't know. And you may need to recover from something that there was no way to plan on. You cannot plan on a meteorite hitting your production facility. There's no way to. What you can do is you can plan to recover. Method through which a threat can act on an asset. Impact. That's where I like to focus. Impact is dollars and cents most of the time. It can be represented that way, but not all impacts comprise the value of an asset. Some impacts are going to comprise the value of multiple assets. Don't be afraid to aggregate here as well. When you're taking a look at this, look at the loss of productivity. That's hard to quantify, but you can do so in person hours. Look at the cost of the response. How much will it take you to go from point A to point Z in your incident response plan, including, of course, breach disclosure? What's going to be the impact of that? What's the cost of replacement? What's the loss of competitive advantage? What kind of fines are you going to face? What's going to be the impact of your reputation? All of these things can be quantified. And if you don't know the hard numbers, use estimates. Put something in here. Now, your CFO says one thing about the value of an asset. Your CEO says something else. Your CTO says a third thing. Who's right? They all are. Beautiful thing is that numbers can be aggregated, and you can take a look at averages. You don't have to play the game of, this person's more important to my company than that person, so I must use his numbers, even though I think the other person's numbers are accurate. Use all the numbers. Don't play sides. Now, getting towards analysis, which is why we're all here. To understand the impact of each asset, establish a scale proportional to the impact, proportional to the frequency, proportional to the strength and capability of the threat and the control, and of course, the vulnerabilities themselves. In order to measure risk, one first must measure impact, frequency, capability of the threat, the strength and control, and the degree of vulnerability. The trick is that some of these things play well together and other things kind of overlap. So a loss event frequency can be expressed, if you choose to, as a factor of vulnerability and threat event frequency. That's getting right out of hand. But what if you don't know the vulnerability level? What if you don't know the threat event frequency? You can estimate at a higher level. Depending upon the data you know, you can drive down or drive up in where you apply your numbers. And this is, again, right out of that risk analysis cookbook. And most people will find themselves where they know what the vulnerability is, but they don't know necessarily what the threat capability or control strengths are, so they'll work off of vulnerability. Or they might have an idea of how easy it is to contact or come in contact with that particular set of data, but they won't understand really what's the probability of action. You can put in estimates at any point here in this food chain and drive the values up to a point where you're actually measuring risk. Vulnerability. Vulnerability is a factor of how capable is the threat and how strong is the control strength. And yes, CVS numbers provide a point of comparison. If you're going to be using CVS numbers, at least be honest and say that the CVS numbers that you have are not complete. That's why you're provided with a calculator. The calculator that's provided by NIST is actually a very, very nice tool to place the measurement of that vulnerability in the context of your organization. That's a lot of work. It involves for every single vulnerability that you have that you care about, going into the system and putting in some external data that could not be put in generically, that is specific to your organization, to derive the actual CVSS v2 number with that particular vulnerability in the context of where it is within your organization. And you may find something that's generically a 10 turns out to be really a 5. That's important for using CVS metrics in order to derive this value of that vulnerability or the criticality of that vulnerability. Now, probability. I love this. Everybody gets probability wrong. Everybody in this room has a 100% probability of dying. Guaranteed. I know you don't want to hear it, but it's true. This is why I'm not known very fondly. Okay. However, your chance of dying at this instant is less than 1%. That's what's known of as an event frequency. You've got a 100% chance of this event happening, but the frequency of this event happening at any particular point in time, that's your event frequency. That's what you really care about. The chance of something happening now, not abstractly at any particular point in time. Now, event frequency can be derived from historical data, but as we all know, past performance is no guarantee of future results, as in Sony the day before the compromise. Event frequency can be estimated as a factor of how easy it is to come across the vulnerability in your system. What is the probability of somebody acting against us? With Sony, that suddenly became elevated when they kicked off a bunch of people. Both can be estimated, and more importantly, you can use the better PERT distribution to get fairly accurate estimates. And then you can calibrate. And we'll get into how you do all of that and how you use that in a few minutes. Yes? How do you get to the particular vulnerability? Okay, so what on earth do I mean by calibration? Let's deal with that issue before we deal with any of the other issues, such as what is the PERT distribution and how you use it. So, who can tell me on what day was the Declaration of Independence voted on by Congress? Don't use Google. Anyone? Good. How confident are you in your answer? I'm confident it's July. 75%. 66%. I like that. Just so happens that it was ratified on July 2nd. You had it 100% right. But you notice he wasn't confident in what he knew, even though he knew it. Learning to understand to what degree you don't know what you think you know, or how confident are you in that knowledge, is what we mean by calibration. The best calibration comes from research, sitting down and reading your Poneman reports, your CSI reports, your Verizon reports, your data loss reports. getting a sense of how frequently these things happen will give you a sense of confidence in your numbers. And when we're working with a PERT distribution, the beautiful thing is that that confidence can be expressed numerically, and that confidence can be used to manipulate results so that they provide you with better results. The trick is how you do that. Now, PERT takes the idea that what you can do is establish a mean that is not your average, but is almost the same value, where you have an optimistic estimate and a pessimistic estimate, and you do a calculation to determine the likelihood. And what David Rose proposed you could do is, if you replace the value g here in this formula with some number greater than 0, less than some other number, you could use that to slide the PERT distribution one way or another based upon how confident you were. The closer you were to 4, the closer you were to, yeah, I know that. Obviously, you can slide it less than 4, you can slide it more than 4, but the idea is the more confident you are, the closer to 4 you want that number to be. Now, there are a number of tools out there that allow you to do this sort of analysis. There's some great commercial tools out there. Those software used to provide their one basic tool for free. It's now available for about $500. RiskAmp provides a great tool out there that's about $200, $300. And of course, there are the beautiful folks over at OpenPERT who provide you with a tool for free. The trouble is with the OpenPERT tool that it doesn't allow you to really play with it, as you'll see in just a few minutes. There is, of course, a tool that pretty much all of us have in our arsenal. It's called Excel. Or if you don't happen to have Excel, you might have OpenOffice with their equivalent of Excel. And PERT is just a formula. And you can write it. And yes, the spreadsheet that I have has got a PERT formula built into it. Not using any of this fancy stuff that we can use and play with and extrapolate information from if you want to have it. So deriving risk. So you've got your catalog, your threat catalog, your control catalog, your vulnerability gap analysis, your frequency estimation, impact, good metric. Now it's time to also do a Monte Carlo simulation. Now I initially planned to do the demo at this point, but because of screen resolution issues, I'm saving all the demo stuff in the end. A Monte Carlo simulation is a way of estimating reality. To show you how successful it was used by the Manhattan Project in order to estimate the size and the impact of the atomic bomb before they blew one up. And it was found to be exceedingly accurate in that calculation. The idea is you take a set of possible inputs. You generate them randomly from a probability distribution. Remember beta PERT? You need a uniform distribution with a large number of inputs. And you perform a deterministic computation, you aggregate results, and you get out of it a pretty damn good metric, a good representation of reality. The idea is that risk analysis does not tell you what reality is. It allows you to model reality. And you can use those models to make realistic decisions that are a bit more meaningful to your business. So, let's step out of the analysis slides, and let's get into the spreadsheet. Now, this is a fairly humongous spreadsheet that came from bits that I've taken and modified. So if you're familiar with this particular spreadsheet as it was distributed by bits, you'll see some interesting differences. You'll also notice that if I were to start demoing this as it is, scrolling to the right, that nothing's visible. So I'm going to break us here out of the presentation in just a little bit. I'm going to change the screen resolution. That's going to make things so that they're less easy to read, but I can show you how this all works. And for those of you who are viewing this ex post facto, my sincere apologies that it won't be so easy to read. So give me just one moment here. Do not pay any attention to the man behind the curtain. Gee, things went blank. Oh no. And we have a spreadsheet that is a little easier to read, or a little easier to work with, I should say. Now I should show you what I've done with this thing and how it works. Now first things first, you're looking at these numbers and you're saying, okay, they're all the same. That's because, well, this is a demo and there's no way in hell I'm putting any real business information into this. I want to show you how it works, not how I've used it. Please, this is not any analysis that I've done of any company. You can distribute this and use this for your own company. There is no business data in this spreadsheet. With that disclaimer out of mind, let's just expand this. Okay, so I've got a nice threat here. Threat category is access control. It can disrupt business through an application software failure where security events are not logged to the application. Okay, as we all know, when security events are not logged, that doesn't really have a very strong impact, but it's something that happens at a fairly frequent basis. That's not something that's going to be necessarily something, just to reuse the word something, because I happen to like something, that you will come across externally. This is an internal threat to your organization, but it could be on an external service. So first of all, what kind of skills or resources are needed? This is where I apply my knowledge. How easy it is to take advantage of a system that is not logged. Damn easy. So we'll set that up to, okay, 98%. And the maximum skills I need, 99%. That actually works. My confidence in these numbers, I'm pretty darn confident in those numbers. So I'm going to say that 98 to 99% of the hackers out there can take advantage of a system that is not logging. So I put in a factor of 4, so I have a capability of my threat of 98%. Nothing's ever 100%. There's always somebody who can't take advantage of even the simplest things. Now what's happening here, to get that threat capability, if you take a look at all the way up here in the top left-hand corner of the screen, is a little PERT analysis. I've taken my inputs, my minimum, my maximum, my confidence, my mode, my most likely. I am aggregating them together. I've applied very, very simple, easy to rewrite formula to get at my results, 98%. That is my mean. It's nothing fancy. But the idea is you do the same thing for control strength. Now I've already said that, okay, great. I do not have logging. My control strength is pretty damn lousy. So I'm going to put in, it's a strength of 5. The mode is probably a strength of 6. The maximum, 10%. Okay. I'll get some value out of this control. My confidence in these numbers, again, happens to be a 4. And so my control strength is not recalculating. So let's just force this thing to recalculate. I just love the demo gods. I have a control strength of 7%. Collapse this as well. Excuse me, the voice does not like Walt at all. Okay. Now vulnerability, I have taken as a combination of my control strength and the ease of access to the particular issue. And so what I've done here is I've just rounded those two values up and compared them on a chart. Let me show you what the chart looks like. And this, by the way, is a variation on the chart that comes with the Basel tool. Not that one. That's loss of frequency. Where's the right? Here we go, vulnerability. Very, very simple chart. Chart that represents the higher the vulnerability and the easier it is to access the vulnerability, the greater the risk of that vulnerability having an impact on your organization. So as I compare the two values together, I come up with a number that represents the relationship between those two values. And that is what I am showing over here on my main spreadsheet. So this value here rounds up from that table and gives you that it is pretty damn significant that I have this vulnerability based upon the strength of my control and the ease of use. The trick is, how frequently are you going to come across this? Now, I should have one of these on my threat categories for both internal and external egress. So from an internal egress, I would say, I'm going to come across this 100% of the time. From an external point of egress, maybe not so much. So I should have two different categories here, one here for internal, one here for external, on exactly the same issue. And I will do exactly the same thing. I'll put in the minimum contact frequency, the mode, the most common, the maximum, my confidence, and come up with numbers based upon how easy it is to encounter this thing. I will also do the same with the probability of somebody acting against this. How likely is it that somebody would go after a system that has this? These are estimates. It's a model. I'm providing my expertise. But remember, I'm getting this all from my experience, and I'm calibrating. The idea is that when you're all done, you have an event frequency that takes a look at how easy it is to encounter something and what is the likelihood of them doing something, and taking those two numbers and again comparing them on a similar lookup chart, getting a number that represents to you what is the likelihood that somebody would do something against this and be able to do harm to my organization, which is different than how vulnerable I am. But I'm using exactly the same patterns in order to produce my results. There's no point in going through it a second time. The next thing that I do is I take a look at impact. I calculate impact a little differently than I've calculated other values. First thing is that not every particular threat is going to have an impact on each different impact category. And so in my master spreadsheet here, I've represented the areas where there is no chance of an impact finance. Where there is a chance of an impact, I've got something here that shows X. Let me back that out. X are places where I do have a chance of impact, and A is where there's no chance of impact, and the values come from just a simple lookup. If this value is an X, pull from the top of the spreadsheet and aggregate the data. Let's take a look at, however, at what we do to measure magnitude. These numbers came from estimates. And just like all the other estimates that I've been working with, I have a minimum impact, I have the most likely impact, the mode, I have the maximum impact, and I have a confidence factor. And just like with everything else, I'm doing a PERT distribution. In this particular case, I'm using one of the open source one of the shareware PERT tools out there instead of writing my own formula to do the same thing that I showed you on the pages. This, however, is an area where this number may not be good enough. So what I probably want to do here is, instead of using my own homegrown formula, I probably want to get in and do a Monte Carlo distribution. So let me show you what OpenPERT will do for you. There are two different PERT simulations in OpenPERT. And by the way, OpenPERT is free and available for you to download. It's an Excel plugin. I'm sorry it doesn't work with the OpenOffice version of Excel, at least not to my knowledge. But what it will do for you is a Monte Carlo simulation. And just like with my own PERT formula, it's going to ask me for a minimum. So I'm going to say my minimum there is 4,000. The most likely, 5,000. And the biggest possibility here is 6,000. Small numbers, but it will demonstrate. Now, how confident I am in those numbers. I'm actually pulling those numbers out of a hat here, so I'm not very confident at all. So I'll put in VL for very low. It builds out a new worksheet within your environment that shows you the results of the Monte Carlo simulation, where it took those estimates that you put in, uses the PERT formula to build out basically values that indicate the impact in money. And you can choose to go with the mean, or you could choose to go with the median, or if it's more valuable, you can go with the Monte Carlo simulation of the minimum or the maximum, the sum. But probably you want to go with either the median or the mean. These are not the numbers that you would have gotten if you had done a PERT distribution once. The idea is that you get more accurate representations of what the analysis is by doing it thousands of times or hundreds of times. In OpenPERT, it only does it about 15 times. There are other tools out there that you can use that will do this hundreds, if not thousands of times, to calculate out what is the likely mean or what is the likely median based upon the data that you provided. If you use these values as the values for your impact, you're having a more likely representation of what the impact is to your organization. And since impact is a bit more important to your CFO and your CEO than likelihood is, so they'll use likelihood as a means to say, I'm going to act on this or I'm not going to act on this. It's really a tiebreaker between, I have two risks with two different impacts. I'll obviously go for the one that's got the higher impact. If I've got two risks with the same impact, well, what's the likelihood of this one happening versus the likelihood of that happening? I'll spend the money on the one where it's more likely to happen than on the money where it's less likely to happen. Now I have some decision making happening that fits within the way that business people make decisions. And so what I can simply do is just make a reference to this particular cell on my spreadsheet within my impact analysis, if I chose to. Or I can use my basic simple PERT distribution that I quote myself or one of these other open tools. The idea is when these numbers are set, I'm going to pull in from here, I'm going to pull in from here, I'm going to pull in from the sum of the result of all of these calculations. I'm going to bring it back, and I put those numbers up here at the top of those columns. Let's just go to the right here a little bit. And I'm getting an estimation of here of magnitude based upon the impact of that threat, where it will have impact. So I can see here that I have a threat that will impact my reputation, but not my competitive advantage. So that particular threat is probably going to have less of an impact than other threats to my organization that would impact both competitive advantage and reputation. These are the numbers that I want to work with. These are the numbers I bring back to my business managers. I have good metrics that they can use. And I also have, to the left, the actual likelihood of something happening based upon your expertise and your analysis, which you can show them. The next step is very simple. Communicate. You bring it back to the organization, you show them the analysis, you show them the threat vectors, you show them the vulnerabilities, you let them make the decisions. You then work on making certain that the appropriate controls are implemented to properly manage the risks that you now have a better handle on than you had before. It's a model. It is not reality. Never confuse the two. When you discuss this with your business partners, and they are partners with you in your enterprise, express this as a model, a representation of reality. And the beautiful thing is, because you are presented as a model, you're not married to these numbers. As you get further and further into doing this again and again and again, your confidence factor will increase. You'll get closer to that magical number 4 as the number estimates become more accurate. The first time around you do it, if you're choosing a confidence value of 4, especially for anything regarding impact, you're probably being overconfident. The first time around. The 10th time around, you've probably got a better handle on what things are going to be like with your organization. That's the problem with outside consultants, is they'll see your organization once. You within your organization have a chance to do this on an iterative basis. And as you do this on a project-by-project basis, you can reuse the same spreadsheet, the same methodology, and aggregate the numbers up to a larger, more comprehensive view of the overall risk to the organization. And the beautiful thing is that you don't have to spend money on high-paid consultants. You've got the tools. Are there any questions? Yes? Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're looking at trying to converse with people, is kind of a loaded word.
Yes.
So an asset is primarily sunk cost. The important thing from it is the cash flow that come from it.
Yes.
Which then I think matches up better to business process analysis.
And you can certainly approach it that way, but there are some things, because the asset value in an accounting view of the world depreciates over time, but the value of that asset to the business does not.
Right.
So you probably want to take a step backwards and say, okay, I want to look at those assets too. But probably more importantly, I want to look at the assets of the organization where the value does not depreciate over time. As an example, the value of the data within the organization rather than the value of the computers that store the data within the organization. If you can start to have a conversation with the individuals within the organization regarding the value of the data, not revolving the assets that store and hold the data, then you're going to have an asset that does not devalue over time, but rather the value of the asset may actually increase over time. That's going to be a more important discussion to have with the business, and you'll have a lot more credibility as a result of it. So don't be afraid to lead them on if they're telling you that their assets are your computer systems and just box you in there, because after all, information technology happens in computer systems. Turn the tables on them, start talking about the data within those systems. That's what they really care about. That's what you really care about. Work together with them to determine the value of those assets. A strangely valuable partner in asset valuation for your organization is the insurance people. If your organization has been well structured enough where you have cyber insurance or other insurance to cover information security breaches, you've got some very, very good asset valuation that's already been done. Leverage it. Make your CFO your friend, make your CTO your friend. They're more than happy to sit down and have that kind of conversation with you. But you really have to, well, I say yes, take all the information they give you for asset valuation. You want to drive the conversation a little bit, because you don't want to get at assets that depreciate over time. You want to get to the valuation of assets that will grow in value over time. Those are the ones that have the real value to the organization.
That's why I think that just looking at cash flow rather than asset period, because if you've got $1 million making machine, it doesn't matter. What matters is it makes $100,000 with a widget.
Yep.
And so if you're matching it with $100,000 rather than $1 million, you're on more of a, it's more apples to apples.
Absolutely. But both sets of assets are important, and both should be captured within here. The value of the widget-making machine. What's the impact to your organization if it's down for 30 days?
Yeah, but again, that's going to knock $100,000 out. $1 million doesn't matter.
Yep. Yes.
So this still seems like a vulnerability-centric approach to determining impact. I mean, from incident response perspective, the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited is 1. So it's not a discussion about what is the likelihood of something bad to happen. It is when something bad happens, what is going to be the impact. So then, to this gentleman's point, obviously you have to have that critical, to use the bad word, you have to have that critical assets list of what are the things that are going to be important to the business
Yes.
at that point. And then when something bad happens to those things, whether it's the widget machine or the data on the systems, what's going to be the impact to my CFO or to the operations folks. So the vulnerability perspective doesn't seem as meaningful to me.
The vulnerability perspective is meaningful to you as you need to manage and mitigate the vulnerabilities. Different vulnerabilities will have different impacts to the same asset. So by calculating out what is the potential impact of a denial of service vulnerability versus the potential impact of a meteorite strike, they're going to have two very, very different results. Denial of service will have percentage of dollars over the period of time of the actual attack. Meteorite impact on your production data facility, that will have a different impact, which hopefully you have a business continuity plan in place to deal with. But you use that second impact to drive putting in place that business continuity impact. You have different things to put in place to deal with a denial of service attack based upon the asset valuation of that threat.
It's two different areas. So you've got risk assessment from the vulnerability standpoint, and ultimately what this should help you probably do is drive where you want to spend and allocate dollars for additional mitigation. Whereas when you're talking incident response, that's you guys come up with a plan as to what are critical assets and what are those steps that need to be taken when it comes time to invoke that incident response plan. So I'm with you on where you're going, and I see what you're trying to communicate. I think they're two different. The way that I use this personally as a CISO is from the standpoint of budgeting, how I'm going to spend my dollars based on where I see my business going.
If you take a look at the spreadsheet right up here on the screen, you can see two very, very different dollar evaluations based upon threats to the organization. Both things may happen to you. So both may have an impact probability of 1, if you go back to your language. If they happen, well, one of them is going to have an impact of $30,000, one of them is going to have an impact of well over $1 million. Where am I going to spend my money in defending my organization is what this tells me. I'm going to spend my money on that $1 million impact, even if there's much more likelihood of that $30,000 impact happening. I may throw some money at preventing that $30,000 asset, but I'm not going to spend a lot because, after all, it's only $30,000.
Well, it also tells you how much you should really spend.
Exactly.
That's the case.
I mean, you're not going to spend more than $30,000 to protect the
Exactly.
I'm going to spend a fraction of that $30,000 protected, or I'm going to spend.
And you're never going to spend more than what the probable loss could be.
Yeah.
Except for the act of God scenario, the tsunami, the earthquake, the meteor. All of these scenarios have the same end result, right? So a system is compromised, adversary moves laterally, expels your crown jewels, and now you're, even though the vulnerability itself may have been identified lower on the scale, the net result to the enterprise is the same.
Nonsense. The net result to the enterprise will be very different if you have a data breach that exposes your email addresses versus a data breach that exposes that kiddie porn was in your environment, or a data breach that exposes the company's financials, or a data breach that exposes PII.
But you're not looking far enough down the food chain.
No, you need to, and that's why you break down impact into multiple categories, and you look at, can this particular vulnerability have an impact on all of these categories, or only an impact on the subset?
You're assuming adversary is going to stop at phase 1 of that attack.
No, I'm assuming that for this particular asset, the worst thing that can happen to me are those impact statements. I'm coming up with worst case scenarios.
And it's myopic. The worst case scenario is not limited to that individual system or to that particular asset.
So I do one of these for all my assets. I do one of these systematically for the entire organization for all assets. And that's the problem with this particular tool, and that's where a professional tool can be much more helpful to you, because if I'm filling out a spreadsheet like this for every single asset in my organization, that's a lot of work. Nobody said this was simple. Nobody said this took 10 minutes. To fill out one of these spreadsheets for the one asset, and I've only looked at one asset within my organization, it took me a month's worth of work to do it. To do the entire analysis of my organization, taking a look at all the controls regarding this asset, their effectiveness regarding this asset, against all the different threats regarding this asset, with all of these impacts for this asset. That took me a calendar month of person hours to calculate what the risk was to the organization of something happening to this asset. Risk analysis is a non-trivial endeavor. If you're going to do this comprehensively for all the assets in the organization, that's going to take a serious amount of time. You do this for the assets you care about. And you continue to build that catalog of analyzed risks over time, knowing that this needs to be an iterative process. You don't do this once, you do this systematically. Once a year, once a month, once a week. How important is it to you? How dynamic is your environment? If your environment is one where the controls in your organization are changing on a quarterly basis, you need to go in and adjust these numbers on a quarterly basis. At least to show you and the organization the impact for tightening your controls on the lessening of risk. That suddenly becomes very tangible. We've got about 8 minutes before we're thrown out of the room. Are there any other questions? That would be the next step. And I have not done that yet with this work. Right now, I've only taken it to the point where I can have a good, meaningful conversation with the business on impact analysis. Yes?
Come up with a good way to get to a consistent answer, or at least so you can throw the question of what is the control strength out to 500 people and get similar answers.
Mm-hmm.
The control strength is, I get different answers depending on who I ask.
So put in all the answers and come up with the meaning of them. And then go forward with the aggregate expertise of your organization. Why choose amongst them? They all have their perspectives. They're all valuable. Leverage them all, work on the meaning of that, and go forward. Probably, I hesitate to say, but probably none of those none of those numbers are calibrated. Probably none of them have thought through, how do I know how strong this control is? Have I done the testing? Have I done the analysis of it? Or have I just say, no, SSL is great, it's wonderful. It's an armored truck running through a bad neighborhood. Like hell it is.
Yeah, usually the guy that put it in has the highest number and highest confidence.
Yeah, and he's probably more full of it. The idea is if you put them all in, and if you don't show any favoritism, it becomes a more meaningful number. And as the expertise of your team builds through incidents, you get a better sense of the confidence in those numbers. Alrighty, so,
Real quick,
yes.
to get an idea of the scope of this, how many lines are there?
Oh, excellent question. Easy to answer. Bits gives you 622 different threats. It's actually half of that because they look at things from both an inside and an external perspective. One of the things...
622 different threats per asset.
Yes, that's why it took a month. The beautiful thing is that you can look at them in categories. I put this into table view. Table view is one of the loveliest things about this version of Excel. So I can say, if I want to look at everything, if I only want to look at compliance issues, I can go through here, select compliance issues, scroll up to the top. Hang on a second as I do that, scroll up to the top. And I can now look at this particular category of threats in isolation from everything else. I can do the same with this kind of vulnerability. I can do the same with this kind of security control. So I have the ability to, once I've done the analysis, to dive deep into any one of these things. So I've got some swag here. Is there anybody in the room who even knows what an HTC One S is? Yours! And I managed to miss the AV equipment. All right, we've got, this has got to be Honey Badger. Honey Badger! This, using my Karnak impression here, this is Bsides San Francisco. You want it. You got it. Oh! That was close. Now that's all to this side of the room. Sorry, I've got one more for this side of the room. Who wants the unknown black sweatshirt or black t-shirt? Done! Sold! For the man who raised his hand.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for coming. It has been a pleasure. Hey, AV guy, I just realized for the entire talk I didn't use the mic. I hope that the audio was speaking loudly.
Good work, Walt.
Thank you. Good question.